Hello. Hi, everyone. My name is Catherine Platt. I'm the director of the Hong Kong International Literary Festival. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the second day of our 21st festival, which is the Rebound edition. Thank you for joining us wherever you are in the world. We have speakers with us today from, I think, 5 different countries. So I know we have people joining us to watch and listen as well from all over the world. So the next 10 days, the festival will present more than 70 online and live events. Please take a look at our website at festival.org.hk and browse through the brochure, have a look at the range of programs. We have some amazing speakers. We're especially excited to have the 2021 Booker Prize winner, Damon Galgut, will be speaking next Thursday, 11th of November. And that event kicks off our festival weekend with more than 50 events that can be joined in person at Asia Society, the Fringe Club and Tai Kwun. So if you're here in Hong Kong, please think about coming along next weekend. But otherwise, we have a lot of online events, more than 30, 36, I think, between now and the 15th of November. So we look forward to seeing you. But first of all, today, it's our second day, first event of the day. Sorry about that. And we have a panel of authors speaking about speculative fiction in translation. In just a minute, I'm going to hand over to our moderators who will introduce them. But I want to just say a couple of things about Crowdcast. If you're joining this platform for the first time, it's very simple. Post your comments in the chat on the right-hand side, anything you want to say. If you have questions for the panel, if you can click on Ask a Question in the bottom right, and then a Q&A box pops up there and you can put your questions in there and I'll relay them to Claire and Dylan. You can also click on the green button at the bottom of the screen, which will connect you to our festival bookseller, Bookazine, to buy some of the author's books. Just to say, this event will stay on Crowdcast until the end of November, so you can watch on demand at any time, and we will be adding Chinese subtitles as well within a few days. So finally, thank you to all of our cultural partners, sponsors and donors for their generous support that makes this festival possible. And in particular today, I'd like to thank the Society of Fellows in the Humanities at the University of Hong Kong for sponsoring today's event. And I'd also like to acknowledge an ongoing grant from the Standing Committee on Language, Education and Research here in Hong Kong. So now I will hand over to our moderators, Claire Gullander and Dylan Suher, who are both fellows in the Society of Fellows at Hong Kong University. And many thanks to Claire and Dylan for putting this panel together and organizing everything today. So I hope you enjoy the conversation and I look forward to seeing you at more events over the next 10 days.
Thank you so much, Catherine. So greetings, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for a discussion today titled Building Other Bodies, a conversation about speculative fiction in translation. As Catherine said, it's really wonderful to see people joining us from around the world to take part in this discussion. Before we introduce our incredible panelists and talk a little bit about the kind of genesis behind this event, I want to just quickly take a minute to thank again those who helped my colleague Dylan Shore and myself put this event together, the Society of Fellows at the University of Hong Kong for financial support, the Hong Kong International Literary Festival, and especially Catherine Platt, and of course our panelists both for agreeing to participate and for being so cooperative despite having to negotiate such diverse time zones. We're really grateful and happy you're here. There's an expression in English, something along the lines of, we are lucky to live in interesting times, or may you live in interesting times, that I've heard in reference to the last few years especially. This expression has always struck me as a kind of mistranslation. Interesting, of course, being a polite way of saying that the times we live in are catastrophic, tumultuous, and violent, and enacting a kind of discursive violence in its own right. After all, for whom are these times interesting, and for whom are they a test of survival itself? For whom a matter of life and death? Interestingly and appropriately, I think for our purposes, a search of this expression shows that it is frequently attributed to a, quote, ancient Chinese curse, though of course, no such expression exists in Chinese. The closest that exists, and I have the written here with apologies, I'm not yet a Chinese speaker, translates roughly to better to be a dog in times of tranquility than a human in times of chaos, and thus holds almost the opposite meaning to the English usage. The origins of this mistranslation can be traced to a science fiction story that was published in an American serial in 1950. And I begin with this example because there's a tendency to think about speculative writing as a kind of necessarily resistant mode. But really, and this is especially true in the West, it was and continues to be a site where racist, sexist, and Orientalist ideas around citizenship and belonging get worked out. I also begin with this example because it shows just how important translation work, particularly thoughtful, politically minded, and culturally situated translation work is. Speculative fiction, I would venture, has always been a refuge for writers brushing up against history's violent fault lines, a way of envisioning alternate political realities, forms of kinship, and environmental futures. The writers we have joining us today are part of this lineage, producing some of the most provocative translations and speculative writings in recent memory. We're honored to have them with us today. Before we introduce them individually, please join me in welcoming them now. We cannot actually see anyone on Crowdcast, but we're assuming everyone is talking. All right, so we'll now introduce our individual speakers. First up, we have Bora Chung, who is a writer, translator, and educator based in Seoul, South Korea. Bora holds an MA in Russian and East European Studies from Yale University and a PhD in Slavic literatures from Indiana University, with a focus on modern Russian and Polish utopian literature. And she teaches Russian lit and science fiction studies at Yonsei University. Her delightfully dark and gruesome short fiction has won numerous literary awards and accolades in South Korea, and she's a practicing translator as well, translating modern Russian and Polish literature into Korean. Welcome, Bora. Next up, we have Anton Hur. Anyone even remotely familiar with the contemporary South Korean literary translation scene will have heard of Anton's work, for he has translated into English some of the biggest titles in recent memory, including Kyung-suk Shin's The Court Dancer, Kang Kyung-hae's The Underground Village, Sang Yong-pak's Love in the Big City, and of course, Bora Chung's Cursed Bunny. A recipient of numerous prestigious translation awards, including a Penheim in 2020 and a Daesan Foundation translation grant. He's also an educator, teaching at Yonsei and the KLTI, among others, and a writer of essays on the politics of literary translation. He's also, and I hope this will come up at some point, the Korean translator of Ocean Vuong's Night Sky with Exit Wounds. So welcome, Anton. Next, we have Mona Kareem. As with our other guests, the breadth and scope of Mona's work is truly astounding. A poet, translator, and educator who writes and works across Arabic and English. She's published 3 chapbooks of poetry, most recently The Trilingual Femme Ghosts, which came out with Publication Studio in 2019. She holds a PhD in comparative literature from SUNY Binghamton and has taught and held prestigious fellowships at a number of institutions across the US and Europe. Her English translation of Ashraf Fayyad's Instructions Within was nominated for the Best Translated Book Award in 2016 and was reprinted by English Pen in 2017. And her translations of Iraqi poet Ra'ad Abdul Qadir came out with Ugly Duckling Press in 2021. Her Arabic translation of Octavia Butler's novel Kindred, which we'll be speaking about today, was released by Takwin Publishing in fall 2020 and received the National Endowment of the Arts Award earlier this year. Mona will also be reading some of her poetry at the festival's closing event, the Wish Poetry Contest, which takes place Sunday, November 14th, 7 p.m. to 8:30 p.m. Hong Kong time. So please do check that out as well. Welcome, Mona.
So it is my pleasure to introduce Ta-wei and Ari Larissa Heinrich. Ta-wei holds a PhD in comparative literature from UCLA and is now a professor at National Zhengzhou University in Taipei, where he teaches LGBT studies, disability studies, and modern Chinese and Sinophone literature. But before he was a scholar, he was already an accomplished writer of queer and speculative fiction. His fiction publications include 2 as yet untranslated collections, in the realm of the senses and fetish, and the book we will focus on today, the 1996 novel, The Membranes. The English translation was published just this year by Columbia University Press, and the novel, despite being 25 years old, presciently addresses such issues as capitalism persisting even after climate catastrophe, personal data and surveillance, gender fluidity and cyborg bodies, and even Zoom fatigue. So please welcome Ta-wei. We are also privileged to welcome the equally multi-talented translator of The Membranes, Ari Larissa Heinrich. Ari received a PhD in Chinese Studies from UC Berkeley and is a professor of Chinese literature and media at the Australian National University. His scholarly work examines how the Chinese body has been defined through the languages of medicine and technology and through literature and audiovisual media. So a topic exceedingly relevant to The Membranes. In addition to The Membranes, he has also translated Last Words from Montmartre by the Taiwanese queer phenomenon, and I think in no small part, thanks to Ari's efforts, now a global queer phenomenon, Miaojin. So now just a word on the structure of today's talk, and sorry for all the preamble. Claire and I have prepared some questions for the panelists, and we intended to vote about 30 minutes at the end for audience Q&A. But before Claire and I get to our questions, we've asked the panelists each to say just a few words about their respective speculative works, what inspired them to write them or translate them. So maybe we can begin with Ari and work backward in reverse order of the introductions.
Oh, you're muted, Ari.
Thanks for the generous welcome, everybody. And I really appreciate being invited to join in the conversation. I'll just keep it really brief for my part. As a translator, I think one of the earliest experiences I had translating was with a totally different work, now long gone, that I didn't really enjoy. And it's just such a simple thing, but now I try to translate specifically materials that speak to me, the kinds of things I want to read. But also, and I'll be really curious to hear what other translators have to say about this. But I feel to some extent when translating, I get to take on the role of writer. And so I'm thinking of myself in that role and wondering what kind of writer do I want to be? Whose work do I want to be that intimate with? And that was a guiding decision for me. The Membranes is a book I've always admired and always wanted to read and make available to my friends and other people who don't read Chinese. And that was a really strong motivating factor. And also, I think the timing was, for an English translation, I mean, it could have been translated much sooner, but the timing now as Chinese science fiction in English translation has a vogue, that it's a really good time to have a work like The Membranes available to really round out the picture, to complement some of the wonderful translations that are already out there and give English language readers a real spectrum, a real picture of what kinds of material, how diverse it can be.
Should I? Okay, thank you. Thanks everybody, and I'm honored to be here with so many talented friends. I think that the Membranes is motivated by the idea that many LGBT people have some ambivalent attitudes to their societies. It's a case in Taiwan as well as in many other countries. So LGBT people want to escape from the mainstream societies, but at the same time, they want to be accepted. Maybe they will even want to collaborate with the societies. That's why in The Membranes, I portray the protagonist as an ambivalent daughter. At the same time, she wants to escape. She wants to be left alone by the corporate world. But at the same time, the readers will find that she is also co-opted by the system. And while she is being co-opted, she also gets some paradoxical warmth from her mother. So that's what I want to try to explore in the novel. Thank you.
Thank you, Ta-wei. Who is next then? Mona?
Okay, yeah, I was not sure. First, I mean, thank you for having us, and it's a pleasure to be with all these great and over-accomplished translators and creatives. I will say that the only piece of fiction is also the only piece of speculative fiction I've translated is the only piece of fiction also. I am, mainly a poet, and I thought that I would only translate poetry. I never thought I would ever make this betrayal. And I go by translation with poetry. It's like you take your time, you get to explore this poet, you're just like living this thing, developing a relationship with that poet and their poems as well. But at some point, I read Kindred by Octavia Butler, and then for some reason I read it another time, and the second time was such a different feeling than the first one. The first one was more of an impression, and the second time I felt like how much it grew on me and dug holes inside of me, and how much it just like creeped inside me, and I felt like this is a novel I might be able to actually sit with, and see what comes out of this. I talked to a publisher, and this publisher was, I didn't know things can happen this fast, and he was like, yeah, we got the rights, let's go, let's get to work. Yeah, but I maybe in more questions I can talk about this more, but it was a challenge to say, oh, I'm translating speculative fiction, because that's not really a formulated subgenre in Arabic literature, so for me, translating Kindred was about, oh, this is speculative, but not really, right? It's something between different genre writings of fiction, and also so you feel like you're arguing for a kind of genre writing, but at the same time, of course, there is that urgency for a different kind of historical fiction, right? It's so dominant. What else can we look at as a different model of historical fiction?
Thank you so much, Mona. Who's next? Anton, I guess?
Yeah, so it's really interesting to hear the motivations of our other panelists and how they got to do their work. Mine was very simple. I care very deeply about how Korean literature is perceived overseas. And most of the things that we were exporting were, white, cishet, not white, sorry, Korean cishet men who were middle-aged. And that's fine. And I've translated them as well myself. But I wanted something I wanted to present something that I knew was exciting, and it was more, was non-men, was more, speculative and genre adjacent. And so I was very determined to get Korean speculative fiction and translation off the ground. I was not alone in this. My fellow Smoking Tigers translator collective translators, such as Sung Ryu, who translated Miaojin's Tower, and Sophie Bowman, who translated I'll Be Waiting for You by Kim Bo-young. So they were also very keen on expanding what Korean literature means to a general audience. It was very gratifying to be a part of a movement like that, and to be able to really show the world how we have great speculative fiction writers Bora Chung, Kwak Jae-sik, and Chun Sa-me. Chun Sa-me was my first author that I ever translated and got published, and they're amazing. And so, and I feel like I don't want to take credit for Squid Game, but it is interesting that Squid Game came out when it did. When all these publishing houses were buying up Korean speculative fiction. So yeah, it's a very interesting coincidence there. And I decided to translate Bora in particular because of all the writers. They're all great writers, and I don't want to imply that they aren't otherwise. But Bora's language is just so wonderful and beautiful. Chongsame's language is also so perfect and crystalline and crisp. And so I really wanted to handle like them as writers. And even if like Bora had written something that was like not speculative fiction, I still would have translated her. That's how wonderful her language is. And it's kind of interesting how I kind of set out to find a speculative fiction author, and then I found someone who was just as literary as Kyung Suk Shin and all the other great Han Kang and all the other great Korean authors. So yes.
Thank you so much, Anton. Bora.
Hi, my name is Bora. It's an honor to be here. And well, I started writing speculative fiction without knowing the word speculative fiction. I just wrote because I was confused. And then I started translating mainly because I was confused. My Russian and my Polish wasn't very good. And in class, I couldn't understand what I was reading. So I started translating. And I got more confused. And the authors I translated and the authors I am translating are mostly dead white guys, European guys, but they are killed by Stalin and the Nazis. So I guess that makes it better or not. Yeah, I'm not making much sense, but now after 20 years of writing and translating, I think I'm getting less confused and more pissed, more angry. So that's the way my fiction is evolving. In terms of my translation, I'm working on Stanisław Lem, who was not killed by the Nazis, not killed by Stalin. So that's a change. That's a good thing. Yes, thank you.
Thank you, everyone. This is very helpful context. I suppose we'll jump right into the question of genre, and it's kind of a neat segue because you were talking about genre just now. I wonder if we might begin by talking about like the affordances of speculative fiction, like what it enables you to do. So I'll pose this again to Bora and I guess Ta-wei. What is the appeal of this genre for you both as writers, critics, and translators? In what ways can it be limiting? In what ways can it be generative? And we might also, like you hit on something that I've been thinking about, Bora, which is that like speculative fiction, it's quite, like how do you personally define that term? Myself as a teacher, I'm drawn to it because I see it as quite malleable, but there are hardliners who have very kind of rigid ideas about what it is and should do. So thoughts on this?
Should I?
Okay.
Okay. I think that, thank you for the very important question. I think, yes, in fact, over the decades, many have asked me why I would choose to write science fiction or speculative fiction instead of the more traditional realist fiction, because maybe you know that the realist literature of the realism has been popular everywhere across East Asia. But I find that when I grew up, I was already fed up with the tradition of realism. And while I knew that many other queer writers in Taiwan also wrote in the realist tradition in order to attract the mainstream readers, I didn't want to do it. That's why I chose to write science fiction. I think I don't think that maybe I shouldn't say I chose science fiction. I should say science fiction chose me, because because of science fiction, I could write something other than the realist fiction. And one final thing I want to mention, I find that all of the texts we are talking about here, right here, deal something like filial piety in each Asian society. We know that, okay, filial piety is so cheesy and we are so fed up with it. And especially queer people don't want to talk about filial piety to parents anymore. But I find that it's very interesting that all of us are dealing with the topics, how to deal with the tension between children and their parents. And I myself try to explore this tension with science fiction. And I think that because the realist tradition has done so much on this, and there should be other ways out. Thank you.
Should I talk about something?
Yes, sorry. Yes, Bora, please.
I can shut up.
Please.
Speculative fiction. Well, I was never formally educated in writing. I mean, in writing fiction, so I have no idea. Like, I don't have the language or to make a coherent argument about speculative fiction. But I agree with Ta-wei saying that he was fed up with realism. I was fed up with realism, and in mainstream realism, there is no language to describe our experience. I think for women, for the disabled, the LGBTQ, and all kinds of other minorities, their experience just not in the mainstream experience. So reality was boring, and reality didn't, I mean, I couldn't understand my reality. That's why I started writing speculative fiction, and later realized that there was a name for it. And it still appeals to me because anybody can be the hero, and anything could happen, and you can make sense out of anything. Even if it doesn't make sense, you can make sense out of it, the nonsense. So that's the appeal. And I think it's in that sense, it's a much larger and much greater genre than realistic fiction. So I don't want to be stuck with reality. I want to get out of it.
So before we move on from this question of genre, because Mona, because you brought this up in your introduction, could you talk about what the challenges in kind of marketing Kindred in Arabic, and what kind of translation process you had to do there, and then we'll move on to a broader question about translation and speculation.
Oh yeah, I have so much to say about this. Because, you know, and one thing I'll say, like literary critic and theorist Abdel Fattah Klito, he's a Moroccan literary critic. He says Arabic literature, the Arabic canon, taught Western literatures the genre, you know, but this is now happening with subgenre. You know, do we bring in subgenres of fiction? Do we not? I'm always scared of like how literature might become a Walmart, you know, of like, you know, just replicating itself everywhere. You know, so I feel like even the fact that I chose Kindred to get translated and to become one of the very few, you know, speculative pieces to be translated into Arabic, I think that was such a good choice, because it's not really like the traditional sci-fi piece, you know. It's like, as I said, it's like hybrid genre. And I really love, like, when I went back and read the literature, you know, I have like obsessive tendencies to read everything around a text before translating it. So I saw the debates on, oh, is Kindred sci-fi or not, right? And then one of the arguments, which is hilarious to me, says like, it's not because time travel was not like explained. You know, by the end of the novel, it was not explained how did that happen, the time travel. Like, why did you expect this to be explained? You know, like, isn't this explained from the beginning? So my publisher says to me, like, when he talks to people, like say in book fairs or something, and he tries to sell them Kindred, you know, and he says like the word sci-fi, and people react badly because like people have an idea that sci-fi is like Star Wars, you know, and I don't know, Star Wars is a certain taste of, or a particular taste, I guess. So I used to, you know, I would joke with him saying like, yeah, say it's travel literature, you know, say whatever, right? But then this made me like also think of the fact that time travel was used in this way, the fact that, for example, Butler always talked about, no, this is not sci-fi, because she was sick of being, you know, kind of like put in a corner, you know, oh, like the Black woman who writes sci-fi, you know. So she wanted to be like, I actually can write you the stuff that you guys write and do it even better, you know. And she did so, right? But it was beautiful to start thinking of Kindred in relation to Beloved, right, of Toni Morrison, because both of them have these like elements, right, like the supernatural, and you see different reception of each novel, you know, and how the aesthetic are were handled. And when I went back and saw like how American literary critics responded to Beloved, they were also critical of the witchcraft and the sorcery, you know. They were also, this is not explained, or some people labeled it as magical realism. So this makes me wonder, what is magical realism, what is sci-fi, what is, you know, all of these labels. I do feel like there is a value to genre fiction. I feel the tradition of realism is so heavy in Arabic fiction. Of course, the Soviet influence, you know, social realism. There was a commitment to that. So I feel like, you know, anything that can get me away from historical fiction, I'm down. I'm sick of historical fiction. You know, so I just feel like these, like genre fiction, when it travels, it creates really interesting conversations that yeah, so generative and beautiful, and center back the aesthetic, you know. Let's talk about aesthetic again, because yeah, we can be all smart, but how can we translate it into a text?
So let me pick up on that question of just speculation and its relation to translation, right? And I guess I'll direct this to Mona, Anton, and Ari, though really all five of you translate, so anyone can weigh in here. So Anton, you've written about how necessary what you call cunning, the ability to slip into another perspective, is for translation. And you've written this amazing piece for Asymptote, Fictional Notes Toward an Essay on Translation, in which you imagine your identity literally blurring with Bora's with other translators. Everyone should read this. I'm gonna pop a bunch of links here after this question in the chat, and Catherine, if you can share them, that would be good. Ari, you've written really beautifully about a trans methodology of translation that, I quote, is inseparable from a utopic imagining that foregrounds race, class, animal, and environmental liberation. And then Mona, you have this beautiful poem, Eulogies for Futures to Come, which begins with this image of two female astronauts thwarted in their ambition by men, and concludes with these lines: a woman such as myself is raving in a forest of translations. On fire, her broken tongue makes the note, there is a world in us, we are hardly amused. So let me finally launch this question from this image of translator as an astronaut of the internal cosmos. We're curious about the speculative utopian dimensions of translation practice. How is speculation, however you might define this, connected to translation for you? How might speculation concretely factor into your translations? And maybe, Ari, you want to start off? Or?
You're muted, Ari.
Sorry about that. I keep blocking out the entire Zoom universe sometimes. But thank you for the really wonderful, for the thoughtful and deep question, which is kind of a wonderful statement in and of itself. And I think part of, and again, I wonder what other folks here will say, because I don't feel like authoritative on the question of speculation that way. But I appreciate the privilege of being able to inhabit, or to pretend to inhabit, the author's mind when trying to open up a space for readers to speculate. And it relating back to what we were just hearing you speak on genre, there's no limit I think that's one of the beauties of speculation in speculative fiction, that, you know, call me cynical, but I feel like most written work is fiction anyway. And at least in the context of things that we identify as speculative fiction or science fiction, there's no pretense to that. And in fact, the world tends to dismiss, as you were saying earlier, tends to dismiss speculative fiction as something like just Star Wars, whatever that even means, without actually crediting it for doing a very important job, like the very hard work of imagining the future, of modeling different scenarios. Climate change, which is one of the areas that Ta-wei wrote about, so in Membranes, is an example where, you know, we can, why limit how we understand the consequences of climate change? And who's going to be free enough to incorporate everything from scientific data to imaginative potential to understand what those things are going to look like? So that's where I'm going to turn first to speculative fiction and perhaps second to other studies in trying to understand and make sense of the world. And the world's kind of spinning off the rails. And I mean, it always has been, but it seems particularly acute lately. So that aspect of being somehow involved in the process of opening the door to speculation and to giving these genres the credit they're due for taking them very seriously as contributions to history, to literature, to the future. That's definitely an aspect that is on my mind when I'm translating and reading speculative fiction. It's sort of a lateral, indirect answer to your questions.
Anton, would you like to respond?
Sure. So I'm glad that you mentioned that story where I become Bora. I thought so Anton is obviously, like, it's not my real name. It's not my given name. It's this persona that I perform in order to do my job. And translating my authors, there's a kind of point where I think, like, at what point is my author performing being the author? And at what point are they, you know, a real person? Because, like, when Bora and I meet, like, we don't talk about literature at all. We just talk about other stuff, like we're just, you know, friends. But when I'm being Bora by translating her, I always feel like there's a Bora who is a writer, and that Bora who is a writer is like sitting across from me, and she's telling me these stories and I'm writing them down in English. So that's like the feeling that I kind of inhabit in there. So there is a performance of being Bora, of being Tanzan, of being Anton Hur, even of being even myself. And I think this is obviously a very, like, queer idea for me, because part of being, so much of gender identity is, you know, a performance. It's produced through a performance. This is a very old and classical idea. It's, yeah, not my idea at all. And so to me, translation and being queer or queering are very close together in that way. It's something like what Ta-wei said earlier about, you know, queer people wanting to imagine a different future or a different present or a different future where we don't have to think about filial piety all the time. And it's something like that, what he was saying, where queer people and kind of like is like translation, in that we're trying to break down the barrier between two things that are so considered like a binary, like this is a literature in this language and this is a literature in this language, never the twain shall meet. Or, you know, and people make such a big deal about the differences between these two literatures, but there really isn't. And, you know, and like, I think Mona mentioned this as well, like when we think about genre, like, you know, I mean, where does the genre begin and where does it end? Beloved is a ghost story. It's clearly speculative fiction, but it's not marketed as it. So is this all just marketing? Yes, the answer is yes. Is it just marketing? And so as translators, I think for us, we know that gender is a performance and genre is a performance. And so we are invested in breaking down these force binaries And it's really interesting how many queer people there are in translation. I wrote a whole essay about it because there was at one point I was like, oh, you're a lesbian. I'm like, there's so many gay people in Korean literature and translation, like being translators. And I don't think that's a coincidence or an accident.
This is, go ahead, Mona.
I'm sorry. No, please go ahead.
This is actually, it's a really good segue to our next question, which is precisely about this idea of translating gender and gender fluid bodies in speculative fiction, and particularly into or across non-Romance languages, right? Anton hit on something really important, which is sort of like the performativity aspect of gender, and like translation is potentially a queer practice. And I know that there's a lot of early like feminist translation theory is this idea of fidelity, or like something like filial piety was something they were very invested in breaking down, but at the same time they were still very invested in keeping the binary, right? And I think what we're talking about here is veering into something different. So I would like to pose this to Bora first, because it was her excellent idea to bring this up in the first place. But I think that Ari might have interesting things to say as well, simply because the membranes and also Last Words from Montmartre are very rich texts in this respect. So what are some of the like the challenges that come with translating gender and gender fluidity into across Romance languages, non-Romance languages, and what do you see as like some of the generative possibilities that might accompany that act?
I was actually hoping to hear from other translators from other languages. Well, I came up with that question. Well, that question popped up because I translate from Russian and Polish mainly. I do English translations, but mainly Russian and Polish. And both Russian and Polish have three genders, three grammatical genders, male, female, and neuter. And and the Polish language is more evil. Russian language reflects the gender of the subject in adjectives and in the past tense of verbs. Polish reflects the gender and the person of the subject in the past tense. So Polish has like 8 or 9 forms of past tense because it also has male virile. So like women and dogs and things are categorized into one, and male persons who can generate offsprings are categorized. They have a special category. That's what my teacher said when I was learning Polish, like male virile people who can generate offsprings. I'm like, but women give birth, like you're nothing if you don't have a wife. And so whatever. So I learned these languages, and my own language doesn't have any gender. We are intrinsically gender fluid because Korean language has, well, we say that woman, that man, but we can just say that person. And we can just talk without a subject. The grammar itself is fluid. And like, I think Chinese is the same. And we don't really have any grammatical structure. So I have no idea how foreigners learn Korean. Like, there's no way you can learn Korean. But so it's a total chaos. And I want to reflect the original language and my target language when I translate. And my editors get really angry. Like, you don't have to repeat the subject every single time. And I'm like, yes, I do. So what's your experience in other languages? And I'm really interested in your Arabic experience, Mona, because I have no idea how things work. Thank you.
Thanks. I'll weigh in briefly as well. And I do love this question. Thank you, Bora. I think one thing that occurred to me, it's basically that gender itself is a false cognate. our obsessions with pronouns are understandable for many reasons in English, but of course in Chinese, at least spoken Chinese, modern spoken Chinese, it's not necessary to designate, to distinguish he or she. And that's really convenient. And it's sort of a relief, frankly, if you've been raised in a language that insists on distinguishing all the time. So there's that aspect, actually looping back to Anton's comments about speculating. There's a pleasure in translating where you can be relieved of the burden of that. On the other hand, translating from languages that don't insist on those particular linguistic gender definitions does put the burden on you as a translator to suddenly make some critical decisions. It's a little bit like, non-consensual making decisions about somebody's gender or sex, without being able to interrogate them specifically about it, and without being able to allow the flexibility for those characters to speak to them for themselves. And that's actually another thing which I love about the membranes, is that it's really a meta experience when it comes to gender, because the book is also, I mean, Ta-wei, correct me if you feel differently, but I have read the book as a book about writing as well. Among the many things that it treats, it addresses a lot of how narratives make up our own identity. And one of those narratives, spectral kaleidoscope of those narratives, tends to bloom out through the prism into things we understand as gender. So I feel like, yeah, there's nothing like translating from a language like Chinese to English to really highlight the challenge of agency in assigning gender as a translator. Suddenly you're in the role of, surgeon or something. Like, which thing are you going to reveal? Because knowing that the reader's going to focus in on something instead of something else, how do you manage that?
Mona, would you want to weigh in as well?
Yeah, I feel like I have to because Bora said like Arabic. But no, I mean, thank you. I will say that my experience was exactly the opposite, because Arabic is very gendered, singular, plural, all the verb endings as well say that, So, imagine when I translate certain texts that are actually consider this, in imagining the story or the text, that there would be play on the pronouns, and that would be, or that the pronouns are neutral. But I also want to say, after years of frustration, of feeling, and I've heard this from, queer people, especially if their connection to Arabic is more of everyday Arabic, they're not necessarily, let's say, they work in the language or something, and they express this frustration to me of I don't know what to do, what is the solution? And one of the solutions has been that we have the dual pronoun, and it's out of use. It's usually informal Arabic, and now queer people want to take that and bring it back and say oh, this is the neutral one, which I think is not working, because that is gender too. So but because it's awkward, people wanted to reclaim it and use it. But I'll tell you a story. I don't know if it really fits, but for example, one time I translated a poet from English to Arabic, and there was a love poem, and somehow I assumed it was addressed to the male. I don't know why I assumed. I'm colonized in the mind, maybe, and then I realized much later, I'm why did I assume this? Actually I can very much imagine this is addressed to say female, or to the female pronoun. And then in Arabic, I noticed I got it because of Arabic poetics, where, the beloved one is addressed in the male regardless of their gender. And all these big male poets, have addressed their loved ones, or their love subjects in the masculine. And this is something across canonical Arabic poetry. And of course, you discover later that some of these poets are queer, of course, you know, like that's part of the story. And then this fell out of fashion, you know, like this with modern poetry, this fell out of fashion. And of course, like the heterosexual cis male poet dominated with his voice that always feminizes everything from land to sun to you know, women's body, you know, like that kind of gaze. So I was wondering with myself, like, can I bring that, you know, that homoerotic, like masculinize everything back, you know, is that something I can do? Maybe I'll have to try.
So I'd like to kind of continue this discussion of gender and extend it to the body. Claire and I titled this conversation "Building Other Bodies" because on one hand, all of your works are full of the kind of racialized, queer, gendered, grotesque, and other than human bodies that thrive in speculative fiction. So in Membranes, we have the memory skins and the androids. In Cursed Bunny in the Head, we have this waste body. And in Kindred, we have these bodies that record history. So we wanted to ask about these bodies and then also consider a larger body, the corpuses of speculative fiction, of fiction in translation. Our question is, what kind of bodies do you like to write and to translate? And what kind of bodies of writing do you hope your works are contributing to? And maybe if I can invite Ta-wei to respond first.
Okay, thank you. I remember in the 90s, many literary critics and scholars and literary prizes in Taiwan complained that younger writers tend to pay too much attention to depictions of bodies than their predecessors. And because of their complaints and the protests, I found that I was even more motivated to depict more. And it's certainly a way to challenge the elder generation and as well as the tradition that according to which the bodies were not clean enough to so-called pure literature. So that's what I wanted to do in the 90s. But at the same time, I also resisted the temptation to present the so-called beautiful, muscular or handsome bodies, which LGBT people used to prefer during that time. And of course, we see that such lookism is even more horrifying, pervasive now. So that's why I think that when we talk about bodies, when I write about bodies, I want to challenge two traditions. So the one is that the heteronormative tradition. The other one is that I prefer to portray the so-called grotesque bodies, which are underrepresented even in queer culture. And I think that maybe many of us share the same interest. That's why when I read Bora's stories, I'm so thrilled to find that many bodies in your stories are also very grotesque. Thank you.
Thank you. And maybe just to keep the balance between writer-translator, Anton, what kind of bodies do you like to translate?
Oh, I love translating Bora's bodies. All the bodies of Bora. So this is Bora's current book. It's called To Meet Her. As you can see, it's in beautiful trans flag colors. And this is a science fiction collection. It's more science fiction than Cursed Bunny, which tends to lean a little bit more to fantasy. And the really extraordinary thing about this book is the preponderance on body. I think this book has more to say about bodies than Cursed Bunny, where I'm really interested in like the mechanical bodies that are in this story. One of the stories is told from the perspective of an elevator. And the elevator is able to connect to the Internet of Things of all the apartments in the building so that it could curate the elevator experience for each inhabitant of the apartment. And then it kind of falls in love with one of the inhabitants. And it's very sweet and completely heartbreaking. And it's very interesting in how, I mean, in Korea, it's like, oh, a man and a man like kissing each other in a book. Wow, that's like a big deal. And, well, this is an elevator and a human being. So it's kind of like pushing kind of like the boundary of what, like, a subjective body, like a subjectivity can be, and like what these bodies that we don't associate as bodies, what kind of subjectivities they may contain. And this book is kind of filled with that kind of, with those metaphors. And as a queer person, I'm absolutely interested in these kinds of narratives, and narratives written by trans people, for example, or narratives written by people who are sort of thinking about, the boundaries between like, where does my body begin and end? Another story in here is that there's a memory scanner, a person who scans a person's memories, and this person is in a coma and their memories are being scanned. And so the body becomes a kind of landscape. And so it kind of goes the other way. It's not like the landscape becomes the body, but the body becomes the landscape, or maybe it goes both ways. It's very fascinating. And I love kind of like having these new ways of thinking about my body, because like Ta-wei said, there's so much, there's a lot of weird issues with bodies, in the LGBT community. Of course, there's lookism, and of course, there's like all the other things, like we don't feel comfortable in our bodies, or we feel like, oh, like, why am I so gay? Like, some people think that way. Some people think that way. And so I'm really interested in these preponderances on like, our prejudices and our fears about our bodies, and taking them to their natural conclusion and like blowing them up basically, or showing us how ridiculous they are, or showing us how like, no, the real thing, the important thing about a love between an elevator and a person is not the fact that there are these two bodies. It's the fact that, this love exists, and it's real, and it's beautiful. And those are the kinds of stories about bodies that I want to tell.
These are fantastic answers. Anton, will you be translating this? Yeah.
I will be translating this. I have done a sample for it. We're shopping it around right now. And it hasn't been sold yet, but because it just came out of Korea too. It hasn't been sold yet, so let's keep your fingers crossed.
We will. That sounds amazing. We are, as predicted, we're quickly running out of time, so we have to skip ahead to our last question. So I'd like to open the floor now to audience questions as well. If you could please write your questions into the chat box per Catherine's instructions. Dylan and I will field these in the order they were received once our conversation is complete. So our final question, I'll direct this to Mona, but really everyone I think will have something to say about this. Anton especially. But it's a question that's sort of about the problem of English. The directionality of literatures and translation, as everyone here well knows, is pretty woefully uneven. And while translating into English can promise greater international visibility, it also can come at a cost, right? Feeling like you're contributing in some ways to this uneven paradigm. I want to know firstly, what are some of the joys of translating into non-English languages? Conversely, when you do translate into English, are there ways that you play with the English language to that enable you to also sort of be critical of its status as like its kind of hegemonic position as lingua franca? And then finally, if you had to speculate on the futures of translated literature beyond the monolingual or the Anglophone, what would that look like?
Thank you, Claire. Like, wonderful question. Three-part question. And yeah, I will say when it comes to English and you know, let me take use of the fact that we have two Korean writers, translators here to share the story. I was struck by the fact that a lot of the new literature that is getting translated into Arabic from Korean, which is, you know, very few titles, but when they get translated, of course, usually through English, but sometimes there are direct translations. This has, of course, there's a lot of readership for this, even though it's recent. I would say East Asian languages in general, they used to be translated into Arabic through French or English, and sometimes through Russian. So we have a new generation who are, you know, people who went and studied and, you know, are focused on this. But I was struck when in conversations with editors and translators that how publishers rely on the English translation to like revise the translation they're offered, or sometimes it might even adapt the whole translation according to the English. And of course, you know, some of you know the case of the vegetarian and how it was translated. So when you see a translation that was that contested, and then that translation becomes at the center of all other translations. So I thought this example, you know, shows this like vicious hierarchy that English, you know, occupies and that we are not even aware of, you know, and it happens in these back rooms. And you would think like we are in the same continent called Asia, why would we not have that direct, you know, cultural transaction? But the positive note I will say is that in Arabic, retranslation is such a big thing. You know, so every like book gets translated 3-4 times, and it has to do with also ignoring copyrights. So like there's a whole, you know, culture of free translation, and I love it. And there's a whole like even, you know, like this niche interest of like, let's read the retranslations and compare them and say who failed, like who is like less authentic, you know, like there is that interest. I will say when it comes to like the joy of translating into Arabic, of course, it's like a very like beautiful, complicated joy because, you know, it's like my mother tongue. I'm comfortable in it. It's my first language. I wrote and published in Arabic. I only write in English because I found myself in exile, you know, and I had to speak with these people. So, but, you know, when I translate into Arabic, like there's such a beautiful thing in how English helped me rediscover Arabic, you know, all these like words that I just took for granted and, you know, constructions and descriptions. So I love how English helps me like stop or like translation, let's say, not necessarily the language, stop and think like, is it really like yellow or is it dark yellow, you know, like these things that, if you are someone fascinated with language, they make up your day, you know, like that's what you take with you. But one last thing I want to say is that, you know, I am someone who thinks like, yeah, you can translate because you love a text, you know, this is so legitimate, you know, you enjoyed it and you translate it. But I personally feel like in Arabic literature, we like modern Arabic literature, there is a love to like cannibalize translation. You know, how do we, like we read a translated work, but then when we bring it in conversation, you see like contemporary works responding to it, totally overlooking the fact that this text came from abroad, you know? So I love that we have this approach to translation because usually people like to be like, this translation influenced this, you know, like this passive understanding of translation as like just consumerist, which is not true. Like what we translate, how we translate is all about like how, yeah, literatures interact really, right? And readerships interact.
Yeah, I'll just add a little quick story to the amazing things that Mona said. I love that idea of all these different translations and them kind of being loosely copyrighted. When I was contracted to do Ocean Vuong's Night Sky with Exit Wounds into Korean, the first thought that I had was, wow, I'm gonna put so many footnotes into this thing because I am not allowed to use footnotes in Korean literature translating into English, to the point where, let's say Bora has a footnote in her story. I'm not allowed to translate that into a footnote. I have to gloss it into the main text because apparently English readers hate reading footnotes, which I think is a lie that we keep telling ourselves. So I was like, I'm gonna footnote the mother out of this manuscript. But then when I translated it, I didn't put in any footnotes. And because I have been too brainwashed at that point to like, and so when I handed it to the publisher, the Korean publisher's like, oh, you don't have any footnotes. Like they immediately noticed it. And I said, I feel myself incapable, too brainwashed and incapable of discerning like what needs to be footnoted. So if you just highlight the parts in the edit and tell me what I should footnote, then I will gladly footnote them. But otherwise, I'm just too far gone. Go, leave, save yourselves. And so I will say though that translating, so it's been very normative translating into English. I have to say, like, there are a lot of things where they're like, oh, you can't do that, you can't do that. But then I think things are getting better, to be fair. And we are foreignizing a lot more. And my editors certainly have been very, very open to like changing things around and like keeping things like Korean, you know, and like there is a discussion obviously that's going on in the editorial sphere about this as well. So I think, yeah, we are rapidly evolving in that sense. So it's looking to be a better future.
So we're running till 11:30, and we'd love to hear from the audience. Catherine, if you could go ahead and pass those questions on. Yeah, and I just, you talked to certain American publishers, and I think they're pretty convinced that American readers don't like reading. So it ends up. But we have a question here from Nicole. How has translation of speculative fiction changed over time? As an American who is often urged to read the classics of the genre, I'm often struck by the racism, homophobia, sexism, Orientalism, etc. of classic works. Is it harder to translate something like Dune as opposed to more modern works? I don't know anyone who wants to respond to that.
I'll just throw one idea out there and then leave the field on that. And that's that, especially in the context of the last question we were discussing, I was thinking about the idea of how many languages get erased in the process of translation, especially when you're translating between imperial languages. So between Chinese and English, Japanese and French, or languages that I've worked with in various degrees of aptitude. And recently, I've been in a separate project thinking a lot about volcanoes here in Australia and learning about and looking up old translations of volcanic geology in graphs. And I stumbled across some ones in Japanese, and I was busily looking up the kanji and then trying to translate them between Japanese and English and Chinese, and realizing that, you know, local indigenous populations have been speaking about volcanic activity for tens of thousands of years. And when I translate between those two imperial languages, I'm completely erasing all of these other rich languages that are going to do a better job, or that just have other perspectives. So coming back to the reader's question, I'd say, for example, with Dune, which languages are we translating from and to? And who's the consumer there? You know, that's the only point I wanted to bring there, is to consider which languages are getting left out in the process.
That's a really, thank you, Ari, for that. I think that's a really important point. We have a question from our colleague, Sue Kim, for Bora, which says, you've published translations before you published creative writings, now working on both on translation and creative writings. I wonder how you felt about your English translation. Did you have a different relationship with the translated texts of your Korean creative writings compared to your own translation of Polish or Russian texts? And then she gives the example of other Korean writers like Bae Swa, who writes and translates German fiction to Korean.
I published my Korean short story, The Head, in 1998. It was a college competition, so it was not like national or anything, but it was published first, and then I started translating. So technically I started writing first and then translating later. I feel awkward about both. I still do. And I have no idea how I'm doing with my translation. I always feel like I've done something really wrong, that I'm misrepresenting these authors. But as I told you, they are mostly dead and they were killed by Stalin or by the Nazis. And I have no idea how to, like, I cannot ask them what's going on. So I don't know. Well, since you've given me the chance, I apologize to Platonov and Bulgakov and Bruno Schultz and everybody I've translated. I translated one living author, I think, and he's a Czech person. I don't speak Czech, and I don't know how that happened. I do not know Czech, and I translated his works. And and he doesn't know Korean, so he didn't say anything. As for my own, the translation of my own works, somehow Anton's translation sounds better than the Korean original. So you should all read his translation. Thank you.
So we have a question here from Catherine Fox, who says she's been thinking about how some forms of speculative fiction serve as an intellectual and ethical space for groups that have not necessarily been trained in literature or acculturated towards literature, but who are implicated directly or indirectly in the design of our society. I'm thinking about engineers here, but I'm wondering what you are thinking about the question of reach, especially for groups that might not be exploring these questions in other areas of their works or lives. And I wonder if I could maybe just expand that question into ones of audience. Are the translations reaching people the original didn't? What kind of response have you received?
So in the case of Cursed Bunny, it was a speculative fiction bestseller in Korea, and it went up those charts. And people who read speculative fiction have read Cursed Bunny. But it's interesting that the English publication is a little different, because I think it's Honford Star has a different marketing angle, where they tend to, the books that they publish are genre, but they're also very genre adjacent. They want writing. They want the writing first and foremost to be extremely literary. Like that's their number one priority in publishing their books. And so you have this kind of interesting overlap between people who would normally not read science fiction or speculative fiction. And I have seen so many posts and reviews of Cursed Bunny where they're like, this is not normally the kind of book that I read, or this is kind of like, I really don't like horror, but I like, I really enjoyed this book, or or the book is just horror enough and not going into a territory where they can't stand or something. And so that's kind of been really interesting. It really goes back to what Mona was saying earlier, really, about how a lot of like things that we think are like hard and fast boundaries is really just marketing. The nose, or the perfumer of Chanel, I forget his name, I'm sorry. He like said on record that the only difference between perfume for men and perfume for women is marketing. Like they're the same. We just market this for women and market this for men. And so I think it's kind of almost like that as well, with books as well, especially books like the ones that you see, like The Membranes, or Kindred, or Cursed Bunny.
Thank you. That's really great, Anton. We have a question from Lola Yang. Says, thanks very much for this generative conversation. she says, I have a relatively personal question for everyone. And we've spoken about this, but a little bit, but it's an occasion to expand. Do you feel there's anything kind of inherently queer in all sorts of definitions with speculative fiction?
May I say something? I think that yes, when I write my science fiction stories, I tend to I set up certain criteria for myself to follow. The first one is that I will prioritize characters who are not male, and so in fact sometimes I have more female characters than male ones. The second is that I will prioritize whenever I write homosexual characters, I will prioritize lesbians over gay men. And I find that why I do this, because science fiction enables me to do so many different things which I cannot do in other genres. So I think that I really have to take the advantage of the genre to do crazy things. But I know that some of my readers are peaceful. For instance, some of my gay friends tell me that they are so disappointed that they seldom find satisfying gay characters in my fiction. So what's wrong with Ta-wei's identity? And I think that sooner or later I might need to go back to pick more gay male characters to satisfy my friends.
I wonder if I could just quickly follow up on that, Ta-wei, because I was curious about, again, this question, sorry, of expanded audience for the membranes. I wonder what kind of people did it reach in the 90s and who is it reaching now? And you can start, an Ari, I'm sure you're also hearing back from people now who are discovering the book.
Yes, but I might reveal something kind of embarrassing of Taiwanese society, because in Taiwan we know that the literature readers are usually female rather than male, and the lesbian readers buy more books than gay men in Taiwan. So when I published my my stories in Taiwan, I didn't mean to write for female readers, but because the market was like that, so naturally female readers were have been more visible to me than the male ones. It's a case in Taiwan, but Ari's translation shows me something different, because I find that the English language readers of the Ari's translation are quite diverse. They are from very different genders, ethnicities, and so on. So very different from the landscape of Taiwan. With that.
May I say something about science fiction being queer and about that engineering the society and colonialism? I once translated this Russian author, Ivan Yefremov. It's a utopian novel entitled The Andromeda Nebula. And it was really, really, really famous in Russia in the 1950s. And then the author fell out of favor from the Communist Party, and then he kind of disappeared. So this is a utopian novel about 3,000 years in the future. And of course, the entire Earth is a communist society, and everybody's white. And he inserts one Black character and one Japanese woman. And for some reason, he keeps calling that Black character, he's an African guy, and he keeps calling the guy the African, even though he has a name. And he doesn't do that to his female Japanese character. Like, this only Black guy is the African. Everybody else has a name. And that was his utopia. And everybody is heterosexual, everybody, every single person. And 3,000 years in the future, and this is a utopian society, they got rid of gays. Like, how is this utopian? So I don't think, I think literature is a tool for propaganda, because education was a privilege, and being able to write, not just being able to read, but being able to write was a privilege. And privileged people wrote their privileged white European cisgender hetero male literature, and that seeped into every single genre. And now we are claiming that back. So there's some really evil literature there, but he was well-intended, and that was the most evil part. Like, that he was really well-intended in his part. So I wrote this really long translator's preface, explained everything, and then I translated the work as it was. I don't know how other people do it, but I wanted to show that the concepts of utopia, the concept of a better society, changed over time, and literature, the literature as propaganda could be really evil, but we can change that. So yeah, that was my take. Thank you.
So we still have about 10 more minutes left. If people in the audience have questions, please bring them in. In the meantime, I do have a question about thinking again, moving from the body to this question of communities. I have a question about the family, right? So family is brought into question in all of these works. Family, or a kind of family, is right in the title of Kindred. And I'm very curious, Mona, how you translated that word. Cursed bunny is full of, to use your words, Bora, parents who destroyed their children's lives. Membranes, on the other hand, is a novel centered on a constructed family. So we'd like to ask about this key term, the family. How do you write about the family? Is it possible to imagine a family that functions? How have your families, biological or chosen, shaped your work as writers or translators? What are the broader families of this work? And maybe we can start with Mona and then go to Ta-wei.
Yeah, thank you. I would say that I am always asked this question, actually, how did I translate it? Because guess what? I failed, you know, because how can you make such a word? You know, it's like, you know, kindred is like my people, my kind, but it's also playing on kind. It's also playing on the idea of a different lineage, right? There's so much meaning to it, and it's magical and poetic. And so what I went for, you know, there was a way to do some kind of variation, you know, like this constructed variation that I could have mimicked in Arabic, but then I felt that it wasn't inviting enough, you know, to the book. And already the book is already like too different, let's say, and hard to label. So what I went for is Nesab, which is 3 letters. And maybe we can say it's going for kin, really, K-I-N. And my idea was that, you know, in Arabic, we have like the etymologies. Once you go to them, they generate so much, you know, like different words and different meanings. And I'll say something because, you know, as you said, it's like in the title and the family and what makes family. And of course, like the idea of ancestry and lineage for Black people in America, you know, due to slavery, due to all these practices of breaking the family and subjugating people by dispersing them, right? It was so interesting to see that when Arabic readers read the novel, that was very clear to them, you know, because that was like, in the sense, like it was clear to them how violent and different this is, because they started thinking like, oh, these kids that are born to the master are not his kids, you know, and like he can also sell the kids, you know? So like to them, like that broke even the idea of lineage, you know? The idea of lineage is that, you know, it would be biological, right? At least in the standard. So I saw like some conversations around this. And I think, you know, that helped also stress this feminist framing that Octavia Butler went for, right? That, you know, it's yeah, of course, it's blood, but also it's the blood that was spilled in all this, you know, violent history, and how people came together to resist and how they claimed their agency, you know. So, you know, you see the meaning of the family transforming throughout the narrative. And I think, you know, these realizations of like, yeah, you construct the you know, the, let's say, oppressive and cis hetero family, and then you deconstruct it as you just like survive this violence even.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I think that some of you know that there is a tradition of queer literature in Taiwan for maybe more than 50 years. And it's interesting to notice that actually many works in the tradition of queer literature in Taiwan are actually more concerned with families rather than romantic or erotic adventures. So the queer people in Taiwan are, I mean, at least in literature, are more concerned if their parents would be peaceful by them. Meanwhile, they might not be that concerned if they can get the lovers they want. And I find that although I want to escape from the tradition, I also find that I'm already situated in it, and I'm simply trying to respond to the tradition in some different angles. I also talk about family all the time, and I try to depict, imagine the alternative families enabled by the gimmicks of science fiction in some of my stories. So I think that perhaps it's a sweet burden that I and my fellow writers have to carry on. I mean, family is a sweet burden.
Thank you so much, Ta-wei. I love this.
Thank you.
Of family is a sweet burden. We're really pushing it, but we did get one final question, and I'd love to ask it if everyone is okay with this. Okay. So from Marina, thank you very much for this wonderful discussion. Their question is about the notion of the translator's subjectivity. How do you navigate your own interpretations or reading of the text, especially with speculative fiction, which is so ripe with symbolism and metaphor, etc.? Do you just lean into your own reading, or do you step back and try to look at the text from a different, like what we might call a more objective point of view? Maybe one person could respond to this, and then.
I have a pretty simple answer to that one. I ask for a lot of help and do many, many drafts. It's a pretty laborious process, but at each stage, I'll ask native speakers to make sure I'm getting the basics right. And then by the final stage, I'll give a draft to someone, usually a writer in a similar genre, who doesn't speak any Chinese, and ask them to read it too and respond. And then I try to integrate all of that and, do some math and I wind up with something that feels true, but is also accurate, whatever accurate means. And then, and I'm sure other translators here have had this experience, then you hand the baby over to the editor who covers it in red marks. So, it's a very long process and a very, very long distance traveled between my personal interpretation of something and what winds up in the book.
I have an ideology, or like it's close to a religion, where no matter how bad I translate something, the authors that I translate are so talented that their talent will still shine through the bad translation. And this has been true so far. Like when I've had, I have certain authors who can read my translations, like for example, Kyung-Suk Shin, like reads my translations of her work. And my impression that I get from like my authors is that they're not like interested, they're not so interested in me conveying like this, perfectly conveying like the Korean into English or whatever that means. They're more interested in my reading, and they're more interested in what the English will bring, and they're more interested in what English readers will bring to the text and what the English editors will bring to the text. And they're interested in like what does get translated, not in what doesn't get translated, but they're interested in what does get translated. And a lot of it gets translated because, again, you know, I only pick talented writers. I don't translate crap. So so all of that, you know, beauty and talent, like it all shines through my flaws. So this is kind of less of an issue than I think people tend to think.
All right, great guys. We're at 11:30 on the dot. So I'd like to once again thank all of our panelists, the Society of Fellows in the Humanities at the University of Hong Kong for sponsoring this event, and of course the Hong Kong International Literary Festival for hosting. Again, this event will remain online to view on demand until the end of November, with Chinese subtitles uploaded after a few days. This is the second day of the 21st edition of the Hong Kong International Literary Festival. Visit the festival website for details of more than 70 online and live events between now and November 15th. So thank you for joining us. Goodbye, Joygin, Zaijian. Have a good Saturday.
Thank you. Have a good night.